One day, Mama Stan saw her chance. She knew Ndubisi was in his room, and she also knew that she was alone in the compound. She pretended to be spraying clothes outside, but in reality, she was trying to get Ndubisi's attention. As she worked, her curvy figure swayed seductively in the sunlight. Her full hips swiveled back and forth, and her ample breasts bounced with each movement. Her dark skin glistened with a subtle sheen of sweat, making her look like a goddess. Ndubisi couldn't help but notice her. He had always thought of her as just his landlady, but now he saw her in a different light. She was a woman, a very attractive woman. As she accidentally let her wrapper fall, exposing her bare chest, Ndubisi's eyes widened in shock. He couldn't believe what he was seeing. Her eyes met his, and for a moment, they just stared at each other. Her breasts were full and round, with dark nipples that seemed to be staring at him. Her skin was smooth and unblemished, and Ndubisi could feel his heart racing with desire. Ndubisi's face burned with embarrassment as Mama Stan quickly covered herself and rushed inside. He couldn't shake off the image of her bare chest from his mind. He felt guilty for looking, but at the same time, he couldn't help but feel drawn to her. As he sat there, trying to process what had just happened, Ndubisi heard the sound of her door opening. He looked up to see her standing in front of him, a sly smile spreading across her face. Her eyes seemed to be sparkling with mischief, and her full lips were curved upward in a seductive smile. She was dressed in a tight-fitting blouse that accentuated her curves, and Ndubisi could feel his heart racing with desire. "And you, come inside," she said, her voice low and husky. "I need to talk to you about something." Ndubisi hesitated for a moment, unsure of what to do, but Mama Stan's seductive smile and the memory of her bare melon were too enticing to resist. He got up and followed her inside, his eyes fixed on her swaying hips. As they walked into the living room, Ndubisi couldn't help but notice the way her blouse seemed to be molded to her body, accentuating her curves in a way that made his heart skip a beat. Her dark skin glistened with a subtle sheen of sweat, making her look like a goddess. Mama Stan sat down on the couch, patting the seat beside her. Her eyes seemed to be sparkling with mischief as she leaned back into the cushions, her full breasts straining against the fabric of her blouse. Ndubisi sat down beside her, feeling a jolt of electricity as their thighs touched. Mama Stanwell's legs were smooth and shaved, and he could feel the heat radiating from her skin. "I think we need to talk about what happened earlier," Mama Stanwell said, her voice low and husky. Her breath was hot against his ear, and Ndubisi could feel his heart racing with desire. Mama Stanwell's eyes seemed to be burning with desire as she leaned in closer. Her lips were inches from his, and Ndubisi could feel the tension building between them. "What do you want to talk about?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Her smile was seductive as she leaned in closer. "I think you know exactly what I want to talk about." "And do you?" she whispered, her lips brushing against his ear. Her tongue darted out, tracing the curve of his ear, and Ndubisi felt a shiver run down his spine. Her hand was on his thigh, her fingers tracing the curve of his muscle. Ndubisi could feel the heat radiating from her skin, and he knew he was in trouble. He was trapped in a web of desire, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to escape. Ndubisi tried to escape her grip, but Mama Stanwell's hands were like vice grips, holding him in place. He could feel her warm breath on his skin, and her full breasts pressing against his chest. As he struggled to break free, her hands began to roam over his body, tracing the curves of his muscles. Her touch was like fire, burning his skin and sending shivers down his spine. Ndubisi's mind was racing as he tried to think of a way to escape, but Mama Stanwell's grip was too strong, and he could feel himself getting weaker by the minute. Just as he thought all was lost, her hands released their grip on him, but instead of letting him go, she stepped back and slowly began to undress. Ndubisi's eyes widened as Mama Stan's clothes fell to the floor, revealing her naked body. She was a vision of loveliness, with curves that seemed to go on forever. "If you don't do what I say, I'll scream rape," Mama Stanwell said, her voice low and husky. Ndubisi's heart was racing as he looked at her. He knew he had to do something, or risk being accused of a crime he didn't commit. "Please, don't shout," he said, his voice shaking with fear. Mama Stanwell smiled, her eyes glinting with triumph. "Good boy," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Ndubisi hesitated for a moment, then reached out and touched Mama Stanwell's skin. It was like touching fire, and he could feel the heat radiating from her body. Mama Stanwell's eyes closed, and she let out a soft moan. Ndubisi's heart was racing as he continued to touch her, his fingers tracing the curves of her body. As he touched her, Ndubisi could feel his own desire rising. He was trapped in a web of lust, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to escape. As Ndubisi's fingers continued to explore her body, he could feel her responses becoming more intense. Her moans grew louder, and her body began to tremble with pleasure. Her eyes snapped open, and she looked at Ndubisi with a fierce gaze. "More," she whispered, her voice husky with desire. Ndubisi's heart was racing as he complied with her demands. He touched her with increasing passion, his fingers tracing the curves of her body. As they stood there, lost in the heat of the moment, Ndubisi couldn't help but wonder how he had ended up in this situation. He was trapped in a web of lust, and he wasn't sure if he wanted to escape. But for now, he was at Mama Stan's mercy, forced to do her bidding as she threatened to scream rape if he didn't comply. Ndubisi's mind was a jumble of emotions as he continued to touch Mama Stan, unsure of what the future held. As the moments ticked by, Ndubisi's touch became more urgent, his fingers tracing the curves of her body with increasing passion. She moaned softly, her eyes closed in ecstasy, as she arched her back to meet his touch. The air was thick with tension, heavy with the weight of their forbidden desire. Ndubisi's heart pounded in his chest, his senses overwhelmed by the sheer intensity of the moment. And yet, despite the danger, despite the threat of ruin that hung over him like a sword of Damocles, Ndubisi couldn't help but feel drawn to Mama Stan's. She was a force of nature, unstoppable and unyielding, and he was powerless to resist her charms. As the moment reached its crescendo, her eyes snapped open, and she saw Ndubisi Bola's eyes. "Now," she whispered, her voice husky with desire. "Now, let me treat you the way you deserve." As her eyes locked onto Ndubisi's, the air seemed to vibrate with tension. Her hand doings makes Ndubisi moan. Ndubisi's heart racing. He felt an overwhelming sense of desire wash over him. Mama Stan's gaze never wavered, her eyes burning with an inner fire that seemed to melt Ndubisi's resolve. He felt himself being drawn to her, as if by an invisible force. Without a word, Ndubisi's hands reached out, his fingers brushing against Mama Stan's skin. The touch sent sparks flying, and Mama Stan's eyes fluttered closed, her lips parting in a soft gasp. The room seemed to fade away, leaving only the two of them, suspended in a world of their own. The tension between them was palpable, a living, breathing thing that pulsed with an energy all its own. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, Mama Stan placed a kiss on Ndubisi's bola. His eyes snapped open, and she stepped back, her breast heaving with exertion. Ndubisi's hands fell to his sides, his eyes never leaving hers. The silence that followed was oppressive, heavy with unspoken words and unresolved tension. It was as if the very fate of their relationship hung in the balance, waiting to see which way the scales would tip.